We're going to look at the lead in the water situation with Dr. Yanna Lambrinidou. Pardon me, doctor. It's Lambrinidou. Good morning. How are you?
Good morning. Good. How are you?
And you're president of the group called Parents for Nontoxic Alternatives. Can you tell us about that group and the work you do?
Sure. Parents for Nontoxic Alternatives is a local children's environmental health organization that was founded in 2004 to protect Washington, D.C. area children from preventable exposures to environmental toxins in homes and schools and neighborhoods. And the last 5 years, we have worked almost exclusively on the issue of lead in drinking water. And our research now has expanded to look at the problem nationally.
And you yourself administer or work with a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation program, and you've helped D.C. public schools with the lead in the water. Is that right?
That's right.
All right. Well, you've told us of your work. Can you give us some background to the water and lead crisis that we experienced years ago?
Sure. I think that what's critical to remember about this crisis is that there are three main chapters to the story. The first chapter is the cover-up of excessively high levels of lead in our water from 2001 to 2004. Participants in this cover-up were D.C. WASA, the D.C. Department of Health, the Washington Aqueduct, and EPA Region 3 in Philadelphia. So what's important for listeners to remember is that the lead that contaminated our water for 2.5 years was our government's lead. This is really critical for understanding the second chapter of the story. So once the cover-up was exposed by the Washington Post, and that was in January of 2004, everyone, of course, wanted to know if harm had been done. Were our children lead poisoned from the water? The second chapter in the story is astoundingly a second cover-up. 2 government-funded studies that said, we found no harm. Now, this was a scientific impossibility because lead in water had been documented for decades to cause lead poisoning, especially in infants drinking formula and in very young children. One of these no-harm studies was written by the D.C. Department of Health and by the Centers for Disease Control. The other study was written by WASA-paid consultants at George Washington University and again by the Department of Health. And finally, the third chapter in the story is an award-winning scientific study that came out of Virginia Tech and the National Children's Medical Center in 2009 that found that in reality, hundreds and most likely thousands of D.C. children were lead poisoned from the water. And what's interesting is that in 2011, the CDC published a second study that also found a strong link between homes with lead pipes and children with elevated blood lead levels, which really supports fully the Virginia Tech findings.
Well, on that last point, you've given us a segue of connection. You talked about the lead pipes being the contributor, and of course this lead crisis got started by allegedly new chemical treatments allowing the lead to leach out of those pipes. So my question to you is, what were the suggested remedies and resolves regarding the water crisis? Were they adequate? I seem to remember that what D.C. WASA offered homeowners of lead, pardon the expression, infested areas was that a pipe would be run connecting the system from halfway into the street into your yard, but it would not go up to your house. Was that and other remedies adequate?
Right. So the main remedies since 2004 have been to adjust the water treatment at the Washington Aqueduct and make the water less corrosive so that it leaches lead less easily. And that is a treatment that seems to be working as well as it can. It is not a panacea and it does not solve the problem completely. The other quote-unquote remedy has been for the water utility to go and partially replace lead service lines throughout the city. These partial pipe replacements have been shown actually to not be effective in the sense that they can result in lead spikes for the short term after the replacement is done, but also studies are also showing that lead spikes can continue for months and even years after the replacement. So obviously it's really not a good solution, not a good thing to have.
Now, the reason why we're on this subject that both now and in the past, media attention, D.C. Council inquiries, and public outcries seem to indict various stakeholders. a recent report by the Inspector General gives clear indications that the City Council and the public were misled. What were the questions that the IG was called to answer by the D.C. Council, and does the report indeed answer those questions?
Yeah, this is a very, very good question. The Inspector General's report is really, unfortunately, despite the information that is giving us about D.C. WASA's participation in the cover-up, is really old news. It's a regurgitation of a previous report that was done by actually now Attorney General Eric Holder in 2004. The OIG report, in reality, right now, we can characterize as superficial, misleading, and inaccurate. And it's a report that folks should know pulls the wool over our eyes. The investigation that the OIG was asked to do was to verify if the lead crisis of 2001 to 2004 actually harmed our children, and if D.C. officials knew or should have known about this harm. Now, the IG report absolutely fails to do this. It does not conduct a comprehensive review of the studies conducted in D.C., it does not take into account the congressional investigation of the No Harm CDC study. It makes no mention at all of the No Harm WASA-funded study. It misrepresents the views of one of the authors of the Virginia Tech study to conclude that there is still debate about whether harm was done. To our knowledge, there is no debate at all. The authors of the No Harm studies have been forced to issue corrections and apologies, and the Virginia Tech study has so far not been challenged by anyone. In fact, it has won a Best Science Journal award.
And Doctor, thank you. So we're coming to the end segment. We only have very little time. Can I give you a couple of questions before we go? So if you were asked if our water is safe, what would you say? And then where do we go from here? What's the next step? How can our listeners get relevant information and keep abreast of this issue?
Today, D.C. is not facing a citywide problem with lead, but some homes probably still have a problem, and some homes we know have a problem. People should be thinking about filtering and protecting themselves from potential lead in water. People interested in this issue can contact us. We also have a blog online about the issue. And what we must do right now is demand that our city officials finally acknowledge that harm was done, and also demand that the two flawed studies of no harm are finally taken off the scientific record.
And how can people connect with your organization and stay in touch?
Yes, and our phone number is 202-997-1834.
Thank you, Dr. Lambrinidou. That was Yanna Lambrinidou, the president of Parents for Nontoxic Alternatives, and we thank her for the update on our lead situation. Have a great